Picture this, a sunny Tuesday morning outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists are snapping photos, children are laughing, and the famous red-coated guards stand perfectly still like living statues. Everything seems normal until a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses marches up to one of these elite soldiers. What happens next will shock you to your core. This isn't just another entitled person having a meltdown. This is the story of Karen Whitfield, a real estate mogul from Connecticut, whose 5 minutes of fury outside the gates of British royalty would spiral into an international incident that reached the highest levels of government, sparked global debates about privilege and power, and ultimately changed her life in ways no one could have predicted. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. The guard she attacked wasn't just any ordinary soldier. He was someone whose identity would turn this incident from a simple assault case into a mystery that captivated millions and exposed secrets that some very powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Are you ready to discover what really happened when an American Karen met British justice? Because the truth is stranger than any fiction you've ever heard. Karen Whitfield had always believed that money could solve any problem. At 52 years old, she owned 3 luxury real estate agencies across Connecticut and had a net worth that placed her firmly in the top 1% of Americans. Her Mercedes was always spotless, her nails were always perfect, and her expectations were always sky-high. That Tuesday morning in London started like any other day of her European vacation. Karen had booked the presidential suite at the Ritz, hired a private car service, and planned to tick off every major tourist attraction in the city. Buckingham Palace was third on her list, right after the Tower of London and before afternoon tea at Harrods. She arrived at the palace gates wearing a white Chanel blazer, diamond earrings that caught the morning sunlight, and an attitude that had served her well in boardrooms across America. Her husband Robert had stayed back at the hotel with a headache, which meant Karen was free to explore at her own demanding pace. The scene outside the palace was typical for a summer morning. Dozens of tourists clustered around the famous gates, taking selfies and posing for photos. Street performers entertained the crowds while mounted police officers chatted with visitors. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed. But Karen wasn't in a festive mood. She had been trying to get the perfect Instagram photo for over 20 minutes, and nothing was working out the way she had envisioned. First, there were too many people in her shots. Then, the lighting wasn't right. The guards weren't standing in positions that complemented her outfit. And, worst of all, some inconsiderate tourists kept walking through her frame just as her hired photographer was about to capture the shot. Standing at attention near the gates was Lance Corporal James Mitchell, a 24-year-old member of the Coldstream Guards. James had been serving for 3 years and had performed ceremonial duties at various royal events. He was known among his colleagues for his professionalism and his ability to maintain the traditional stoic composure even when tourists tried their best to make him break character. James stood perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat, his rifle held precisely at his side. He had learned to ignore the constant stream of visitors who wanted to pose with him, take photos, and sometimes even try to make him laugh or react. It was all part of the job, and he took pride in representing the crown with dignity and discipline. Karen approached the guard with her photographer trailing behind her. She had decided that she wanted a specific shot, herself posed elegantly next to the guard, with the palace gates perfectly framed in the background. It should have been simple, except Karen had very particular ideas about how everyone and everything should be positioned to accommodate her vision. "Excuse me," Karen said loudly, standing directly in front of James. "I need you to move about 3 feet to your left. The lighting will be much better for my photo shoot." James remained motionless, staring straight ahead as he had been trained to do. His job was to stand guard, not to serve as a prop for tourist photographs. He had dealt with hundreds of similar requests over the years, and the protocol was always the same: maintain position and ignore attempts to engage. Karen waited for about 10 seconds, tapping her designer heel on the pavement. When James didn't respond, her voice grew sharper and more demanding. "Did you hear me? I said I need you to move. I'm trying to get professional photographs here, and you're standing in completely the wrong spot." Other tourists began to notice the interaction. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. A few parents ushered their children away from what was clearly becoming a tense situation. "This is ridiculous," Karen announced to her photographer and anyone within earshot. "I'm an American citizen. I'm paying good money to visit this country, and I have every right to expect basic cooperation. This is supposed to be a tourist attraction, not some kind of military obstacle course. She turned back to James, stepping even closer to him. Now she was standing just inches from his face, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the faint scent of her morning coffee. Listen to me, young man. I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but I'm not leaving until I get my photographs. Your job is to serve the public, and, right now, I am the public. James continued to stare straight ahead, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes. He was a professional soldier, but he was also a young man being publicly berated by someone who seemed to believe that her wealth entitled her to special treatment. Karen's frustration was rapidly escalating into full-blown anger. In her world, when she spoke, people listened. When she made requests, they were fulfilled immediately. When she encountered obstacles, she removed them through a combination of money, influence, and sheer force of personality. But none of her usual tactics were working on this stone-faced guard. Fine, she said, her voice rising to a level that could be heard across the courtyard. If you won't move voluntarily, I'll just have to work around you. What happened next would be captured by at least a dozen different phones and would become one of the most viewed videos on social media within 24 hours. Karen grabbed James by the arm and attempted to physically push him to the side. When that didn't work, she tried to grab his rifle, apparently believing she could simply relocate him to a position that better suited her photographic needs. James, trained in defensive procedures and surprised by the sudden physical contact, reacted instinctively. He stepped back and, firmly but gently pushed Karen away from him, creating distance between them and protecting his weapon. It was a textbook response to an attempted assault on a member of the Royal Guard. But Karen interpreted his defensive action as an attack. "How dare you put your hands on me?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the palace walls. "I am an American citizen. This is assault. This is an international incident." The crowd of tourists had grown significantly larger, with dozens of people now filming the confrontation. Palace security officers were already moving toward the scene, but Karen wasn't finished. She lunged at James again, this time trying to knock his hat off his head while screaming about her rights as a paying tourist and an American taxpayer. "You can't treat me like this," she shouted, swinging wildly at James, who continued to defend himself professionally while maintaining his position. "I know people. I have connections. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Two palace security officers reached the scene and immediately moved to restrain Karen. She fought against them, demanding to speak to a manager, to the Queen herself, to the American ambassador. Her perfectly styled hair was now disheveled, her designer blazer was wrinkled, and her face was red with exertion and rage. "This is not over," she yelled as security officers led her away from the gates. "I'm going to sue everyone involved. This guard assaulted me. I was just trying to take a photograph. This is discrimination against Americans." The crowd of onlookers buzzed with excitement and disbelief. Most had never seen anything quite like what they had just witnessed. Children stared wide-eyed while their parents tried to explain what had happened. Other tourists continued filming as Karen was escorted to a security office inside the palace grounds. James remained at his post, maintaining his professional composure despite what had just occurred. Only the slight adjustment of his uniform suggested that anything unusual had taken place. He would later tell investigators that he had followed proper protocol throughout the incident and had acted only to protect himself and his equipment. But even as Karen disappeared into the palace security office, still shouting threats and demands, none of the witnesses could have predicted how this seemingly simple case of tourist misbehavior would evolve into something far more complex and far-reaching. The videos of the incident were already being uploaded to social media platforms, where they would soon go viral and attract the attention of news outlets around the world. Comment sections filled with debates about privilege, entitlement, and cultural differences. Some viewers sided with Karen, arguing that the guard should have been more accommodating. Others praised James for his restraint and professionalism. Within hours, the hashtag Karen vs. Guard was trending globally, and news organizations were scrambling to identify the woman in the white Chanel blazer who had tried to physically move one of the Queen's guards. What none of them knew yet was that this incident was just the beginning of a story that would reveal hidden connections, family secrets, and a truth that would shock everyone involved. As Karen sat in the palace security office, demanding to call her lawyer and insisting that she was the victim of a serious miscarriage of justice, she had no idea that her impulsive actions would soon uncover a mystery that had been carefully hidden for more than 2 decades. The guard she had attacked wasn't just any soldier, and their encounter wasn't as random as it appeared to be. The investigation that was about to begin would change both of their lives forever and expose a secret that some very powerful people had worked hard to keep buried. But first, Karen would have to face the immediate consequences of her actions, and those consequences would be more severe than anything her money and influence had ever been able to fix. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun had seen her fair share of unusual cases during her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police, but the call about an American tourist attacking a royal guard at Buckingham Palace was definitely a first. When she arrived at the scene, the incident was already over, but the aftermath was just beginning. Karen Whitfield sat in the palace security office, alternating between tears and threats. Her lawyer was already on the phone from Connecticut, her husband was racing across London in a taxi, and the American embassy had been contacted. What should have been a simple assault case was rapidly becoming a diplomatic headache. Mrs. Whitfield, Detective Chin began, settling into the chair across from Karen in the small, windowless room. I need to ask you some questions about what happened this morning. Karen looked up, her makeup smudged, and her earlier confidence replaced by a mixture of defiance and growing concern. I'm the victim here, Detective. That guard assaulted me. I was simply trying to take photographs, which is what tourists do, and he physically attacked me. Detective Chun had already reviewed the security footage and spoken with multiple witnesses. The videos clearly showed Karen initiating physical contact with Lance Corporal Mitchell, not the other way around. But there was something about the case that bothered her, something beyond the obvious facts of what had occurred. Mrs. Whitfield, can you tell me exactly why you chose to approach that particular guard? There were several other guards on duty this morning. Karen shrugged, seeming confused by the question. There was nothing special about him. He was just standing in the spot where I wanted to take my photograph. If he had simply moved when I asked him to, none of this would have happened. Detective Chun made notes, but her mind was working on a different level. In her experience, random incidents often weren't as random as they appeared. She had learned to look for patterns and connections that others might miss, and something about this case was triggering her instincts. Meanwhile, Lance Corporal James Mitchell was being interviewed by his commanding officer, Major William Hartwell. The interview was routine, designed to ensure that James had followed proper protocol and to protect both the guard and the military from any potential liability. Walk me through exactly what happened, Lance Corporal, Major Hartwell said, reviewing the initial incident report. James recounted the events in precise, military language. The woman approached my position and demanded that I move to accommodate her photograph. When I maintained position as required by protocol, she became increasingly agitated. She then initiated physical contact by grabbing my arm and attempting to manipulate my position. I responded defensively to protect myself and my equipment. Major Hartwell nodded. It was clearly a case of an entitled tourist who had gone too far. But as he reviewed James's file to prepare his report, something caught his attention. James had been born in the United States and had moved to England with his mother when he was 5 years old. His father was listed as unknown on his birth certificate. This detail might have been insignificant in any other case, but given that the incident involved an American woman, Major Hartwell decided to dig a little deeper. He made a note to cross-reference James's background with any information they could gather about Karen Whitfield. Back at Scotland Yard, Detective Chun was conducting her own background check on Karen. What she found was a successful businesswoman with no criminal record, no history of violence, and no previous incidents of this type. Karen owned multiple properties, had excellent credit, and by all accounts lived a comfortable, upper-middle-class life in Connecticut. But Detective Chun was thorough, and she always checked family connections when investigating incidents involving multiple parties. Using police databases and public records, she began mapping out Karen's family tree. What she discovered made her stop and reach for her phone. Karen Whitfield's maiden name was Karen Bradley. In 1998, she had given birth to a son in Hartford, Connecticut. The father was not listed on the birth certificate, but hospital records indicated that she had been unmarried at the time. Most significantly, she had given the child up for adoption when he was just 6 weeks old. Detective Chun felt a chill run down her spine as she cross-referenced the dates. The timing matched perfectly with James Mitchell's birth records. But she needed more evidence before she could even consider the possibility that she was thinking about. She called Major Hartwell immediately. Major, I need to ask you some questions about Lance Corporal Mitchell's background. Specifically, his birth records and adoption history. Major Hartwell was surprised by the call, but cooperated fully. He provided the details he had. James Mitchell, born in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1998. Mother's name listed as Susan Mitchell, but adoption records showed that Susan had adopted James when he was approximately 2 months old. The biological mother's name had been sealed as part of the adoption process. Detective, are you suggesting there might be a connection between Lance Corporal Mitchell and the woman who assaulted him? I'm not suggesting anything yet, Major. But I think we need to look into this more carefully. Can you tell me anything about James's adoption? Was it through an agency? Are there any records that might help us trace his biological family? Major Hartwell promised to look into it immediately. Within 2 hours, he had contacted the adoption agency and, with proper legal authorization, had accessed the sealed records. What he found confirmed Detective Chin's suspicions and added a new layer of complexity to the case. James Mitchell's biological mother was indeed Karen Bradley, now Karen Whitfield. But the adoption records contained additional information that made the situation even more extraordinary. Karen had not simply given up her child for adoption through normal channels. Instead, she had used a private adoption service that specialized in placing children with families overseas. The adoption had been arranged through a lawyer named Robert Harrison, who had connections with military families stationed abroad. Karen had specifically requested that her child be placed with a family outside the United States, and she had paid significant fees to ensure that the adoption would be completely confidential and that all records would be sealed permanently. Susan Mitchell, James's adoptive mother, had been a military spouse stationed in Germany at the time. Her husband had died in a training accident just months before the adoption, leaving her alone and desperate for family. The private adoption had seemed like a miracle, giving her a chance to start over with a new baby while beginning a new life in England. Detective Chen stared at the adoption records in disbelief. The odds of this being a coincidence were astronomical. Karen Whitfield had attacked her own biological son, a son she had given up for adoption 24 years earlier, and had apparently tried to forget completely. But the story became even more complicated when Detective Chen discovered why Karen had been so determined to place her child overseas and keep the adoption secret. In 1998, Karen had been having an affair with a married man, a prominent politician whose career would have been destroyed if news of the relationship and the resulting pregnancy had become public. The politician was Senator Richard Hawthorne of Connecticut, who was running for re-election at the time and was already being mentioned as a potential presidential candidate. Karen had been working as his campaign manager when their affair began. When she became pregnant, they had both agreed that the child needed to disappear completely to protect his political future. Senator Hawthorne had paid for the private adoption and had used his connections to ensure that all records would be sealed and that Karen would never be able to contact the child or reveal his identity. In exchange, Karen had received a substantial payment that had allowed her to start her real estate business. Detective Chen realized that she was dealing with far more than a simple assault case. She was looking at a decades-old cover-up involving a sitting United States senator, an international adoption conspiracy, and now a bizarre coincidence that had brought a mother and son together in the most public and dramatic way possible. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle that she hadn't uncovered yet. James Mitchell didn't know any of this information. He believed that his biological parents were unknown and that his adoption had been a straightforward process. He had no idea that the woman who had attacked him was his biological mother, and he certainly had no idea that his biological father was one of the most powerful politicians in America. Detective Chen faced a dilemma. The assault case against Karen was straightforward and could be processed through normal channels. But the larger story raised serious questions about privacy, international adoption practices, and political corruption. She also had to consider the impact that this revelation would have on both Karen and James. She decided to call her supervisor, Chief Inspector Michael Roberts, and lay out the entire situation. Roberts listened in stunned silence as Detective Chun explained the connections she had uncovered. "Sarah, are you absolutely certain about this information? Because if this gets out, it's going to create an international media circus." "I've triple-checked everything, sir. The DNA evidence will confirm it. But the paper trail is already clear enough. Karen Whitfield gave birth to James Mitchell in 1998, gave him up for adoption through a private service funded by Senator Hawthorne, and then encountered him by pure chance outside Buckingham Palace this morning." Chief Inspector Roberts was quiet for a long moment. "What's your recommendation, Detective?" "I think we need to inform both parties about the connection, but we need to do it carefully and privately. They both have a right to know, but we also need to consider the implications for everyone involved. This isn't just about a tourist incident anymore. This is about family, identity, and some very powerful people who thought they had buried this secret permanently. The investigation was about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted, and the simple assault case was about to become one of the most complex and emotionally charged situations that any of them had ever encountered. The truth was finally coming to light, but the real drama was just beginning. The moment when Detective Chun decided to reveal the truth to both Karen and James would become one of the most emotionally charged scenes in this already extraordinary story. She had spent the entire night preparing for the conversation, consulting with psychologists, legal experts, and her superiors about the best way to handle such a delicate situation. Karen was brought back to the police station the following morning, expecting to deal with the assault charges and hopefully put the entire embarrassing incident behind her. She had spoken with her lawyer multiple times, and they had developed a strategy to minimize the legal consequences and protect her reputation back in Connecticut. James had been called in for a follow-up interview, supposedly to clarify some details about the incident. He arrived in civilian clothes, looking young and somewhat nervous about being questioned again. He had no idea that his entire understanding of his life was about to change. Detective Chun arranged for them to be in separate interview rooms initially. She wanted to speak with each of them individually before bringing them together. The weight of what she was about to reveal made her stomach tight with anxiety, but she knew that both of them deserved to know the truth. She started with Karen, settling into the familiar interview room and placing a manila folder on the table between them. Karen looked tired and stressed, but she was still maintaining the confident demeanor that had carried her through decades of business negotiations. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to discuss something with you that goes far beyond the incident yesterday morning. This conversation is going to be difficult, and I want you to know that we have support services available if you need them." Karen frowned, immediately suspicious. "What are you talking about, detective? This is about the assault charges, isn't it? My lawyer told me that we could probably negotiate a plea agreement and avoid any jail time." Detective Chin opened the folder and pulled out a series of documents. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you about something that happened in 1998. Specifically, about a child that you gave birth to in Hartford, Connecticut." The color drained from Karen's face instantly. For the first time since Detective Chun had met her, Karen looked genuinely vulnerable and afraid. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mrs. Whitfield, we have the adoption records. We know about the private adoption arranged through Robert Harrison's law firm. We know about the payments made by Senator Richard Hawthorne. And we know about your son, who was adopted by Susan Mitchell when he was 6 weeks old." Karen's hands began to shake. She stared at the documents without really seeing them, her mind racing back to a time in her life that she had worked very hard to forget. Why are you bringing this up? This has nothing to do with what happened yesterday." Detective Chun leaned forward gently. "Mrs. Whitfield, it has everything to do with what happened yesterday. The guard that you encountered at Buckingham Palace, his name is James Mitchell. He was born in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1998. He was adopted when he was 6 weeks old by a woman named Susan Mitchell." Karen stared at Detective Chun in complete shock, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Finally, she managed to whisper, "That's impossible. That's absolutely impossible. The adoption was completely confidential. He was supposed to be placed with a family in Germany or somewhere far away. This can't be happening." "I'm afraid it is happening, Mrs. Whitfield. The DNA test results won't be back for a few days, but the documentation is clear. James Mitchell is your biological son." Karen buried her face in her hands and began to cry. 24 years of carefully constructed denial came crashing down around her. She had convinced herself that giving up her son had been the right decision, that he would have a better life without her, and that their paths would never cross. The idea that she had physically attacked her own child was almost too much to bear. "Oh God," she sobbed. "Oh God, what have I done? I grabbed him. I tried to hurt him. He must think I'm insane. He must hate me." Detective Chun gave Karen time to process the information before continuing. "Mrs. Whitfield, James doesn't know yet. We wanted to speak with you first. The question now is how we handle this situation moving forward." In the other interview room, Detective Chun was having an equally difficult conversation with James. Unlike Karen, James had no hidden knowledge about his adoption or biological family. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. "I don't understand," James said, staring at the adoption papers that Detective Chun had placed in front of him. You're saying that the woman who attacked me yesterday is my biological mother? The American woman who tried to grab my rifle? I know how difficult this must be to process, James. But, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Karen Whitfield gave birth to you in 1998 and placed you for adoption through a private service. Your adoptive mother, Susan, brought you to England when you were very young. James was quiet for a long time, processing this information. He had always known he was adopted, and Susan had been honest with him about that from an early age. But he had never shown much interest in finding his biological parents. His adoptive mother had given him a loving home, and he had felt complete with the family he had. Did she know? James asked finally. When she was attacking me, did she know who I was? No, James. She had no idea. This appears to be a complete coincidence, as impossible as that might seem. James shook his head in disbelief. My biological mother tried to physically move me so she could take better photographs. There's something almost poetic about that, isn't there? She gave me away when I was born, and then, 24 years later, she tried to push me around again. Detective Chun could hear the pain and confusion in his voice, but she was impressed by how he was handling such shocking news. James, would you be willing to meet with her? Under supervised conditions, of course. I think it might be beneficial for both of you to have a conversation. James considered this for several minutes. Does she want to meet with me? I believe she does, once she processes the shock of all this. James, I should also tell you that there are additional complications to this story. Your biological father is Senator Richard Hawthorne of Connecticut. He was the one who paid for the private adoption to keep your existence secret. If James had looked shocked before, he now looked completely overwhelmed. A United States Senator is my biological father? The woman who attacked me is my biological mother? Detective, this sounds like something out of a soap opera, not real life. I understand how surreal this must seem, but I assure you that all of this information has been verified through multiple sources. The meeting between Karen and James was arranged for later that afternoon in a conference room at the police station. Detective Chun would be present, along with a counselor who specialized in family reunification cases. Neither Karen nor James slept much the night before. When they finally sat across from each other in the conference room, the resemblance was unmistakable. They shared the same eyes, the same jawline, and the same stubborn expression that had been evident during their confrontation at the palace. But now, instead of anger and confusion, both of their faces showed a mixture of pain, curiosity, and hope. Karen spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. James, I am so sorry. I'm sorry for what I did yesterday, but I'm even more sorry for what I did 24 years ago. I was young and scared and selfish, and I made a decision that I've regretted every single day since. James looked at her carefully, studying her face and trying to reconcile this emotional, vulnerable woman with the angry tourist who had grabbed him outside Buckingham Palace. Why didn't you try to find me? In 24 years, you never once tried to contact me or see how I was doing. Karen's eyes filled with tears. The adoption was supposed to be completely sealed. I was told that it would be better for you if I never interfered with your new life. And, honestly, I was also protecting myself. I was protecting my career, my relationship with your father, my entire future. I was a coward. Who is he? James asked. My biological father. The detective told me it was a senator, but she didn't give me details. Karen hesitated, knowing that this revelation would complicate an already impossible situation. His name is Richard Hawthorne. He was married when we had our affair. He was running for re-election, and his career would have been destroyed if anyone had found out about us or about you. James absorbed this information with the same stoic expression he had worn while standing guard at the palace. So both of my biological parents essentially traded me away to protect their careers and reputations. The bluntness of his statement hit Karen like a slap. James, it wasn't that simple. I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought you would have a better life with a stable family, with parents who could give you things that I couldn't provide. And did I? James asked. Have a better life, I mean. Karen looked at him, seeing the uniform of the Royal Guard, the confidence in his posture, the intelligence in his eyes. You seem to have turned out remarkable despite everything we did to you. James smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. My adoptive mother, Susan, is an extraordinary woman. She raised me with love and discipline and taught me to take responsibility for my actions. She's the reason I became the man I am today. I'm grateful to her, Karen said sincerely. I'm grateful that she gave you what I couldn't. They talked for over 2 hours, sharing stories, filling in gaps, and slowly beginning to understand each other as real people rather than abstract concepts. James told Karen about his childhood in England, his decision to join the military, and his pride in serving the crown. Karen told James about her business, her marriage to Robert, and the guilt she had carried for decades. By the end of the conversation, something had shifted between them. They weren't ready to be mother and son, but they were no longer strangers. They had begun the process of healing wounds that both of them had carried for years. But their personal reconciliation was just the beginning of the story. The assault charges still needed to be resolved. The media attention was growing more intense by the day, and Senator Hawthorne was about to find out that the secret he had paid so much to hide was about to become front-page news around the world. The revelation of their relationship had answered some questions, but it had also raised new ones that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, identity, and the price of keeping secrets. The story broke on a Thursday morning when a journalist from the London Telegraph received an anonymous tip about the true identity of the American tourist who had attacked the Royal Guard. Within hours, newsrooms across the globe were scrambling to verify the information and get ahead of what was clearly going to be one of the biggest human interest stories of the year. Sarah Mackenzie, a veteran investigative reporter for the Telegraph, was the first to confirm the basic facts. She had contacts within the Metropolitan Police who had been following the case, and she had managed to piece together enough information to write the first comprehensive article about the Karen Whitfield incident. Her initial story, published online at 6:47 a.m. London time, carried the headline, "American Tourist Who Attacked Royal Guard Discovers She Assaulted Her Own Son, Given Up for Adoption 24 Years Ago." Within minutes of publication, the story was being shared thousands of times across social media platforms. By 8 a.m., the story had been picked up by news outlets in the United States, Australia, and across Europe. CNN assigned a team of reporters to investigate the Senator Hawthorne connection. The BBC began preparing a documentary crew to travel to Connecticut. Social media influencers started creating content analyzing every detail of the original videos from Buckingham Palace. Karen woke up in her hotel room to find her phone buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, friends, and strangers who had somehow gotten her number. Robert, her husband, stared at her in shock as they watched their private family drama being discussed on morning television shows around the world. "Karen," Robert said quietly, "you never told me about any of this. In 15 years of marriage, you never mentioned that you had a child." Karen felt the walls of her carefully constructed life collapsing around her. "Robert, I'm so sorry. I thought it was in the past. I thought no one would ever know. I never imagined something like this could happen." Robert's face showed a mixture of hurt and confusion. "We've been trying to have children for years. We've gone through fertility treatments, adoption consultations, and countless discussions about starting a family. And all this time, you already had a son." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at their hotel room door. Through the peephole, they could see a small crowd of reporters and photographers gathered in the hallway. Their private crisis had become public entertainment, and there was no escape from the attention. Meanwhile, at the military barracks where James was stationed, his commanding officers were dealing with their own media crisis. Reporters had discovered James's identity and were requesting interviews about his reaction to meeting his biological mother under such dramatic circumstances. Major Hartwell called James into his office to discuss the situation. "Lance Corporal, I need to inform you that this story has become international news. We've received interview requests from news organizations in 12 different countries. The Ministry of Defense is developing a media strategy to protect your privacy while managing the public interest in this story." James sat quietly, still processing the fact that his personal family drama was being discussed by millions of strangers around the world. "Sir, what's the military's position on all this? Am I in trouble for being involved in such a public incident?" "You're not in trouble, James. You handled the original incident professionally, and everything that happened afterward was completely outside your control. However, we need to be careful about how we manage the media attention. This story reflects on the Royal Guards, the military, and the Crown itself." The media frenzy intensified when investigative reporters began digging into Senator Hawthorne's background and his connection to the adoption. By Thursday afternoon, reporters had discovered the payment records, the involvement of the private adoption service, and the political implications of the cover-up. Senator Hawthorne was in his Washington office when his chief of staff, Patricia Valdez, burst in with a tablet showing the news coverage. "Senator, we have a major problem. The story about Karen Whitfield and the Royal Guard has expanded to include your involvement in the adoption." Reporters are calling this a political scandal involving secret payments and illegal adoption practices. Hawthorne felt his political career flashing before his eyes. He was currently serving his fourth term in the Senate and had been mentioned as a potential presidential candidate in the upcoming election. A scandal involving secret children and cover-up payments could destroy everything he had worked for over 3 decades in politics. Patricia, get me our best crisis management team immediately, and see if you can reach Karen Whitfield. We need to coordinate our response to this situation. But coordinating anything was becoming increasingly difficult as the story continued to evolve and expand. Investigative journalists were uncovering additional details about the private adoption service that had arranged James's placement, and some of those details were raising serious questions about the legality of the entire operation. The adoption service, it turned out, had specialized in helping wealthy Americans place children overseas to avoid domestic scandal. They had charged enormous fees and had operated in legal gray areas that allowed them to circumvent normal adoption oversight procedures. Several other high-profile cases were discovered, involving celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who had used similar services to hide inconvenient children from their public lives. By Friday morning, the Karen Whitfield story had expanded into a broader investigation of international adoption fraud and political corruption. Congressional committees were announcing hearings, ethics investigators were opening files, and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries were reviewing their records for similar cases. Karen found herself at the center of a storm that was far larger than anything she could have imagined. Her real estate business was being scrutinized by reporters looking for additional information about her background. Her clients were canceling contracts, and her business partners were distancing themselves from the growing scandal. But perhaps the most painful aspect of the media attention was watching her relationship with James being analyzed and dissected by strangers. Television pundits debated whether she was a victim of circumstance or a selfish woman who had gotten what she deserved. Social media users created memes about their confrontation at Buckingham Palace, turning their family tragedy into internet entertainment. James was experiencing his own version of media hell. Reporters had tracked down his adoptive mother, Susan Mitchell, who was now being interviewed about her experience raising the secret son of an American senator. Photographers were following him too, and, from the barracks, hoping to capture images of his reaction to the ongoing revelations. The pressure became so intense that both Karen and James were forced to hire security details and media consultants to help them navigate the chaos. Neither of them had any experience dealing with international media attention, and they were both struggling to maintain some sense of normalcy while their lives were being dissected in public. The legal implications of their situation were also becoming more complex. The original assault charges against Karen were still pending, but now there were additional investigations into the adoption practices, the payments made by Senator Hawthorne, and potential violations of international adoption laws. Detective Chun found herself coordinating with investigators from the FBI, Interpol, and various congressional committees. What had started as a simple assault case had become a multi-jurisdictional investigation involving potential fraud, corruption, and conspiracy charges. Detective, her supervisor said during one of their daily briefings, "This case has taken on a life of its own. We need to be very careful about how we proceed, because every decision we make is being watched by the international media." The public reaction to the story was deeply divided. Some people expressed sympathy for both Karen and James, viewing them as victims of circumstances beyond their control. Others criticized Karen for abandoning her child and then attacking him years later. Still others focused on the political implications and called for Senator Hawthorne to resign immediately. Social media platforms were flooded with opinions, theories, and conspiracy claims about the case. Hashtag Karen vs. Guard was still trending globally, but it had evolved beyond simple commentary about the original incident to encompass broader discussions about privilege, parenthood, political corruption, and the nature of family relationships. The intense media scrutiny was taking a toll on everyone involved. Karen was barely sleeping, constantly worried about the impact on her marriage, her business, and her relationship with James. James was struggling to maintain his military duties while dealing with the emotional impact of meeting his biological family under such public circumstances. But, perhaps most significantly, the media attention was forcing all of them to confront truths about themselves and their relationships that they might never have faced otherwise. The spotlight was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also revealing hidden strengths and unexpected connections that none of them had anticipated. As the story continued to dominate headlines around the world, Karen and James were both beginning to realize that their lives would never be the same. The media storm had changed everything, but it had also created an opportunity for honesty and healing that might not have existed otherwise. The question now was whether they would be able to survive the intense public scrutiny long enough to build something meaningful from the chaos that had brought them together. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Karen Whitfield sat in a small cafe in Canterbury, waiting for her son. The media storm had finally died down to a manageable level. The legal proceedings had been resolved, and she was slowly beginning to rebuild her life from the ground up. The journey to this moment had been more difficult than anything she had ever experienced, but it had also been transformative in ways she never could have anticipated. The legal resolution had come first. Karen had pled guilty to assault charges and had received a suspended sentence along with community service requirements. More importantly to her, she had issued a public apology to James and to the royal guards for her behavior. The apology had been genuine and heartfelt, and it had helped to shift public opinion slightly in her favor. Senator Hawthorne had not been as fortunate. The congressional ethics investigation had uncovered multiple violations of campaign finance laws and conflict of interest regulations. While the adoption itself had been legal, the methods used to conceal it and the payments made from campaign funds had violated federal statutes. He had been forced to resign from the Senate and was facing criminal charges that would likely result in prison time. The broader investigation into international adoption fraud had led to significant reforms in oversight procedures and had exposed corruption in multiple countries. Several other high-profile cases had been uncovered, and Karen and James had found themselves inadvertently at the center of a movement to protect children's rights in international adoptions. But the most significant changes had been personal rather than legal or political. Karen's marriage to Robert had not survived the revelations and the stress of the media attention. They had separated after 2 months of attempting to work through the issues, and their divorce had been finalized just weeks earlier. "I can't build a future with someone who hid such a fundamental part of her past from me," Robert had explained during their final conversation. "It's not about the child or even about the scandal. It's about the fact that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth." Karen had been devastated by the end of her marriage, but she had also come to understand that Robert was right. She had spent so many years hiding from her past that she had never learned how to be truly honest with the people closest to her. Her real estate business had also suffered significant damage, but she had been working with a business counselor to rebuild it on a smaller scale. Many of her high-end clients had disappeared, but she had discovered that there were others who appreciated her honesty about her mistakes and her commitment to making amends. James entered the cafe right on time, as she had come to expect from him. Over the past 6 months, they had been meeting regularly to slowly build a relationship based on honesty rather than the fantasy of what a mother-son relationship should look like. "How are you doing, Karen?" James asked, settling into the chair across from her. They had agreed early on that he would call her by her first name rather than any parental title. Neither of them was ready for that level of intimacy, and they both appreciated the honest acknowledgement of where their relationship actually stood. "I'm doing better," Karen replied. "The divorce is final. I found a smaller flat that I can actually afford, and I'm starting to feel like I can breathe again. How are things with you?" James smiled, and Karen was struck again by how much he resembled her at the same age. "I've been promoted to corporal. The Military Review Board decided that my handling of the original incident was exemplary, and the media attention actually ended up reflecting well on the guards overall. Apparently, I'm now the poster child for professional restraint under pressure." They both laughed, able to find humor in the situation for the first time. The absurdity of their circumstances had become easier to accept as the shock had worn off, and they had begun to process everything that had happened. "James, I've been thinking a lot about something, and I wanted to discuss it with you," Karen said, her tone becoming more serious. "I've been in contact with Susan, your adoptive mother, and we've been talking about the possibility of the three of us having dinner together sometime." James looked surprised but interested. "How do you feel about that?" "I know it might be awkward for you to meet the woman who raised me. I think it might be exactly what I need," Karen replied. "Susan did something for you that I wasn't able to do. She gave you a stable, loving home and helped you become the man you are today. I want to thank her for that, and I want to understand what real motherhood looks like." Over the past months, Karen had been attending therapy to work through her feelings about the adoption her relationship with her own parents, and her patterns of avoiding difficult emotions. The therapy had been painful but necessary, helping her to understand why she had made the choices she had and how she could make better ones moving forward. I've also been thinking about Senator Hawthorne, James said carefully. They had discussed his biological father several times, but it remained a complicated subject for both of them. Have you decided whether you want to have any contact with him? Karen asked. I don't think so, at least not now. From everything I've learned about him, he seems to be someone who makes decisions based on what's convenient for his career rather than what's right for the people around him. I have a father figure in Major Hartwell and in some of my other commanding officers. I don't need another father, especially one who might disappoint me. Karen nodded, understanding his position completely. I think that's very wise. You deserve relationships with people who value you for who you are, not people who see you as a potential problem to be managed. They talked for another hour, covering topics ranging from James's military career to Karen's plans for rebuilding her business. The conversation was comfortable and honest, built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. As they prepared to leave, James surprised Karen with a question. Would you like to come to my graduation ceremony next month? I'm completing an advanced training program, and family members are invited to attend. Karen felt tears welling up in her eyes. It was the first time James had invited her to participate in something important in his life, and it represented a level of acceptance that she had never dared to hope for. I would be honored to attend, she said quietly. Thank you for including me. As they walked out of the cafe together, Karen reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning at Buckingham Palace. She had lost her marriage, damaged her business, and endured months of public humiliation. But she had also found her son, confronted her past, and begun to build a life based on truth rather than carefully maintained secrets. The road ahead was still uncertain. Building a relationship with James would take years of careful, honest work. Rebuilding her career would require patience and persistence. Learning to be genuinely honest in her future relationships would be an ongoing challenge. But for the first time in decades, Karen felt like she was living authentically. The panic and defensiveness that had driven her to attack a royal guard had been replaced by a quiet confidence that came from no longer having anything to hide. James was also reflecting on the changes in his life. The incident had initially felt like a disaster, but it had ultimately given him answers to questions he had never known he wanted to ask. Meeting Karen had helped him understand aspects of his personality and his motivations that had previously been mysterious to him. More importantly, the experience had taught him about the power of forgiveness, both giving it and receiving it. Karen had made terrible mistakes, but she was working hard to make amends and to become a better person. James had chosen to judge her based on her current actions rather than her past failures, and that choice had opened up possibilities for healing that neither of them had expected. The media attention had been difficult, but it had also connected them with other people who had similar experiences with adoption, family secrets, and public scandals. They had received letters from around the world from people who had been inspired by their story of reconciliation and growth. 6 months later, the incident at Buckingham Palace was still occasionally mentioned in news articles about political scandals or adoption reform, but Karen and James had largely faded from public attention. They were both grateful for the return to privacy, but they had also learned valuable lessons about the power of truth to heal even the most complicated relationships. As they parted ways outside the cafe, both of them felt hopeful about the future in ways that neither had expected when this extraordinary journey began. They had discovered that sometimes the most painful experiences can lead to the most meaningful growth, and that family relationships can be built on choice and commitment rather than just biology and obligation. The woman who had attacked a royal guard in a moment of entitled fury had become someone capable of genuine humility and growth. The guard who had been assaulted by a stranger had discovered that the stranger was his mother and had chosen forgiveness over resentment. Together, they were building something entirely new from the wreckage of their first encounter, proving that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to profound and lasting connections. Their story had captured global attention because it contained elements of drama, scandal, and coincidence that seemed too extraordinary to be true. But it had endured in people's memories because it ultimately became a story about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds through honesty, patience, and love.